Today, as the oil crisis moves into daily life, is Asia the canary in the coal mine?
Fuel prices in the Philippines are skyrocketing. The price of diesel in particular has doubled.
Asia's being hit first by the oil shock from the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, but the rest of the world may not be far behind. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Hey everyone. Today would be a really great day to subscribe to The Take on your podcast app. We ask because we want more people to get their daily news podcasts from Al Jazeera. And leave us a review. It helps other people discover the show you already know about. Thank you.
My name is Vina Nadjibulla. I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and I am speaking to you from Vancouver, Canada.
Well, Vina, welcome back to The Take. It's good to have you back on. So there are a lot of really scary headlines when it comes to news around the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. But outside of Iran, Lebanon, and the Gulf, the most alarming ones might be coming from the rest of Asia. So I'm going to just take off a few. In Bangladesh, the war is making it harder to keep the lights on 2,000 miles away. Sri Lanka announces 4-day work week, declares Wednesdays off to save fuel. And the Philippines has 45 days of fuel left, declaring state of emergency. You were just in the Philippines when the president declared that national emergency. Take us there. How did that go down?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Malika, that Philippines is 7,000 kilometers away from the Middle East, and yet the impact of the war was felt almost immediately, both by the government in terms of how the government had to scramble to try to make sense of it, but also by average people. And that's because Philippines is especially vulnerable. It imports most of its crude from the Middle East, and it doesn't have a lot of reserves. And average people really need this imported fuel for daily life, for obviously electricity, but also for something like the transport. I mean, what surprised me was one of the biggest group that was impacted right away were local transport drivers, because they didn't have the fuel and that's their livelihood, right? So for them to kind of be able to not work, I mean, that's an immediate impact. Same thing with fisheries as well, because they need to use diesel to take their boats out in the sea, and that's also their livelihood. So in some ways, Malika, just as it is happening in the front line where the people most impacted are the poor, the same is happening in Asia, where obviously all countries are impacted, but the countries that are not as advanced as, let's say, Japan or China or Taiwan are impacted more. And then within those countries, the people who are already kind of struggling and living paycheck to paycheck are now being impacted the most.
And you were there for your work as the vice president of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Tell me what that meant for your travels and what you heard from people that you talked to about how this was going to impact them, not just in that day-to-day, but also in the very near and coming future.
Yeah. So actually, when the war began, I was in India. And of course, India is next door, but also was feeling the impact right away. And then I ended up in the Philippines, and then I ended in Taiwan. And three very different stories, all very much impacted, but differently. In the case of Philippines, one thing that I also noticed right away was my trip, it was impacted because the government declared a 4-day work week and also encouraged people to work from home. So I was there for a conference. So that was an immediate disruption.
Because it was effective immediately?
Effective immediately, yes.
Wow.
And then there was also regulations around the impact on somebody like me in terms of conferences. That's not life or death. But as I mentioned, there's much more serious consequences. For a place like India, I mean, there was also an immediate consideration for about 9 million Indians who work in the Gulf, right? So, and who obviously were in harm's way and their families were worried, but also who sent remittances back to India. So there's also like an immediate economic impact. And then similarly, India gets most of its cooking gas from Qatar. And when there was shortages of cooking gas, you of course saw this again at every level of society. So poor people who rely on it, but also even in expensive hotels, again, places where I was finding myself, there was like restaurant closing, basically, because they did not have the cooking oil available. So the point being is that the war didn't feel very far away. It felt immediately like the impact was across the board.
So what is happening in these parts of Asia, and why are so many countries so severely hit?
Yeah, so the main reason is because of the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The strait, which is a narrow body of water, 20% of the energy, oil, and gas of the world goes through that strait, but a majority of that goes to Asia. So that's why countries from Pakistan to Japan were impacted the most, so like that entire region, because most of them are very dependent on imports of oil. They don't have domestic supply. And B, most of that came through the Middle East for them. So they were the first ones to feel it. And again, for countries like Japan and China, where they have strategic reserves of oil, the impact was not as severe because the governments were able to step in and take immediate measures. For countries like Bangladesh and the Philippines and Pakistan and even India, the impact was more severe because the reserves are less. So what they had to do was they had to introduce austerity measures, so encourage some kind of essentially savings of, like I said, 4-day work week, working from home, closing universities, as well as they brought in subsidies and price caps, basically, right, to try to keep the prices as low as possible. So you saw that in the Philippines, you saw that in Vietnam, you saw that in Indonesia, you saw that in India. And then the other element, the governments, they really tried to look for other sources, right, including Russia. So when the U.S. allowed Russian oil back into the market, removed the sanctions, that then allowed countries like Philippines in particular and Vietnam to look at Russia as a potential source. But none of this is actually easy, Malika. I think what's really came home to me was how difficult these choices are. Because for a country like, let's say, Indonesia, for instance, right, they're already subsidizing their energy prices, so for instance, fuel, because of the fact that it's imported, and they're spending about $22 billion in their budget already for these subsidies, right? And that was at a cost of oil at $70 per barrel, right? So if it's now over 100, you can imagine what's happening with the budget, right? So, and then they also, in the case of Indonesia, their deficit cannot go more than 3% of the budget of the GDP, right? So it's essentially asking governments to make really difficult choices. If they don't subsidize, they're risking unrest. If they do subsidize, there are issues around their budgets and how they're actually managing basically their economies.
Well, you mentioned the possibility of future unrest. So let's go there, because we know that the region that we're talking about and the countries are no stranger to political unrest. The past couple of years have been marked by mass protests and even revolutions, some would call them, the so-called Gen Z revolutions. I'm thinking of places like Nepal, of Bangladesh.
Nepal's Prime Minister, Sharma Oli, has resigned after violent protests broke out on Monday over a social media ban. Demonstrators have defied an indefinite curfew, stormed Parliament, and set fire to the residences of the Nepalese president and Home Minister.
Protesters stormed the residence of Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. In an address to the nation, the army chief confirmed Hasina had resigned and fled the country.
So these governments are under immense pressure, I imagine, and this could be a test of their ability to deliver on what they've promised, but now with this added stress on them.
Absolutely. They have learned the lesson. They know that a cost of living and especially fuel prices have a direct impact on essentially social unrest and protests, right? And again, we saw that as recently as last year in a place like Indonesia. That's why they have the subsidies to begin with. That's why they try to kind of control fuel prices. But in the current situation, escalation, they really are not going to be able to do that for very long. So that's why they're looking at other options. But I think governments are trying. They're very aware that this can easily turn into a domestic political issue, needing to make sure that they, again, are balancing the immediate needs of their people and cushioning the impact, right? So again, diversifying their supply, trying also to now make deals with Iran directly to get their shipments through, right? So, I mean, we're seeing more of that. Even a country like Philippines is now in direct conversation with Iran to try to get their oil tankers through the Strait.
The distinction here being that some headlines will say that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, but it's not closed. Iran has announced it is closed to those who attack it. And so you're saying these deals might allow this restriction to ease a little bit for some of these countries.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of diplomacy. So India was one of the first countries to directly engage with Iran to try to get relief for its shipments. And then we've seen the same thing now trickling down. I think where things get a little bit trickier are, of course, for the U.S. allies, countries like Japan, South Korea, because they have to kind of manage the U.S. and Iran dynamic. And again, there are no easy solutions. I mean, I think, Malika, what really struck me, especially when I was in the region, was how hard it is for governments to come up with choices. Like even something like, for instance, they're committed, of course, to a net zero and to managing climate effects, but they had to rely on coal again. So in India, for instance, air pollution and quality of air is a big issue. But in a situation like this, where people don't have cooking oil, or when their basically livelihoods are on the line, of course, you have to do what you need to do. And so they're they're maximizing coal production right now to support electricity needs. And that has obviously impacts on health and net zero goals and so forth.
Well, forgive the pun here, but Vina, is Asia the canary in the proverbial coal mine?
Absolutely. So yes, Asia has been kind of the front line of this, but we will be seeing some of these impacts elsewhere because we've spoken a lot about energy, but of course there's also fertilizer and food. And the longer this lasts, the more we'll see the impact on food and then also downstream. So you need energy to be able to essentially produce things. You need jet fuel to fly places. So, I mean, there's the kind of immediate impact, but then there's also downstream impact on everything from tourism to industry production to jobs and growth. And so Asia very much the first one to be impacted in the most immediate and drastic way, but we'll start to see that happening in other parts of the world as well. In Africa and Latin America, you'll see that in the inflation and cost of living. So prices will go up, prices for everything, energy already, but then food will be next. And then airplane tickets, the products that you buy, like even textiles that you buy from Bangladesh or from Vietnam are going to go up in price because the cost of production is going to go up. And Malika, this is all coming on top of everything that we've already experienced in the last 5 years, right? I mean, we can think of 2026 being a really crazy year, and it has been. I mean, it has been a crazy 3 months, but we all lived through COVID. We lived through the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We lived through the trade war that the Trump administration introduced, right, which already had issues. So governments don't have a lot of reserves. People are tired and exhausted.
Yeah, because, you say governments don't have a lot of reserve, but based on what you're saying, these compounding problems we're all about to feel, humans, individuals, we don't have a lot of reserves either.
That's right.
To be able to withstand this, because this is going to be worldwide, right? So earlier this week, we saw the European Commission urging people to work from home, to drive less, to fly less. We've seen similar pleas in Australia.
If you're hitting the road, don't take more fuel than you need. Just fill up like you normally would. Think of others in your community, in the bush, and in critical industries. And over coming weeks, if you can switch to catching the train or bus or tram to work, do so. That builds our reserves and it saves fuel for people who have no choice but to drive.
The island nation of Mauritius announced they only had about 20 days of fuel stock. And in Ethiopia's Tigray region, which is already on the brink of a potential war itself, we saw a complete suspension of fuel supplies that was announced.
Yes.
So, Vina, you mentioned the pandemic. And when we hear world leaders start talking about travel restrictions and how for the next little while, things are not going to be easy, it's hard not to think of what we lived through already and survived for those of us who did survive it. I've seen people comparing this to March 2020, but I've seen others who compare it to the 1973 Arab Gulf states oil embargo and the price shocks that came with that. And some experts are saying this is going to be much worse than that or much worse than the pandemic. So I wonder what you make of these comparisons. Are they helpful or is it going to be so much worse than what we imagine?
I mean, it's normal. We're all human and we want to have some kind of a point of reference, right? We want to understand, is this better or worse than something else? And how are we going to survive this? But I think one big difference is that the COVID-19, I mean, it was something we couldn't really predict it. It was not anybody's fault. I think with this situation, certainly many people around the world see this as a war of choice. They don't understand why this happened, why the U.S. and Israeli governments engage in this action. So I think the emotional reaction to this has been different in my experience. Like when I speak to people, they respond very differently to this. I sort of feel like this is the last thing that anybody needed, especially when you hear and the objective now becomes to kind of reopen the Strait of Hormuz. It's like, well, you essentially are saying now we need to wage this war to go back to where things were before the war started, right? I mean, it just makes no logical sense. And also, we're not just dealing with price shocks, we're also dealing with supply disruptions, right? So, and there's no clear sense of when things can improve because it's, even if there was political will, so like in previous conflicts, there was this idea that when things and basically, when there's a political decision to stop or to reopen supplies, it would happen. In this case, we now have a destruction of infrastructure. So it's going to take time, right? So the impact now is going to be prolonged. And I think that's also something that, again, creates a very different emotional feeling. So this is having a long-term damaging effect on U.S. strategic positioning around the world, right? So to the extent that those people in Washington especially care about U.S. influence, U.S. reputation, U.S. credibility, this is doing tremendous damage to that.
Well, Vina, finally, I want to end by confessing that, before we started this conversation, I had a discomfort with this topic, and maybe 20 minutes in is a strange time to divulge it. But for some of us, this will be about paying a little more at the gas station or delaying a flight because it might be more difficult. Some will experience this as an inconvenience, and I think I count myself right now, at least, in those. While for others, this is going to be existential. For some people, it means loss of life, theirs, their loved ones, their homes, everything they've ever known. So I think you have shown me how high the stakes are throughout this conversation, but I want to end with this for those who might still have this lingering discomfort. How do we process that for some, this will be so much harder than for others?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Malika. And I can see why you would feel that discomfort because, again, you're right that an inconvenience like a canceled flight is not the same as being in a war zone and having your loved one killed. I grew up in Afghanistan and very familiar with an immediate impact of war. So I recognize that we're all experiencing this at different levels, but I think the point to bear in mind is that for some, even as far away as Philippines, this is existential and it is about their livelihoods and their family and their children's livelihood, right? The fact that school children were not able to go to school in the Philippines because buses were disrupted because of a war in the Middle East is something to bear in mind, right? And ultimately, this is about, again, understanding what's happening. I think it would be easy to sort of say, okay, this doesn't impact me too much. I'll just pay a little bit more, or I'll drive less and not go to fill up my car as much. Yes, that's maybe the case, but it won't stop there, right? So if we do have uprisings in these countries, then we're also dealing with issues of immigration, right? And migration flows. So there's a cascading effect that will impact folks. And to the extent that we can, we need to do our part, right? And I guess for myself, Malika, I kind of approach this from the different levels of impact. So first, staying mentally calm and clear. So not looking away, but also maintaining my psychological poise and mental calm, right? So figuring out like how to take care of myself first to be able to show up the best that I can. And then to sort of look around and saying, who's less better off than myself and how do I help others, right? And then kind of moving beyond that, sort of saying, how is this really impacting the country and the globe and so forth? So I think that wasn't probably a clear answer, but my point is that if you think you're not impacted by this, think again. But that doesn't also mean that you need to panic or you need to sort of feel like, okay, well, all else is lost, then I can't do anything. This is too big. We can do something. And it starts with us in terms of not looking away, but also still staying calm and collected. And then figuring out how you can help those who are less fortunate than yourself. And then being in solidarity and extending that kind of circle of impact.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you had to say, and I appreciate you joining us here.
Thank you so much, Malika. Pleasure to speak with you.